When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
ABC Thursdays.
Welcome back.
Grey's Anatomy is all new.
Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant?
The drama going down.
Bungee jumping from the bridge, his cord snapped.
We need all hands on deck.
Is unbelievable.
You think you're God's gift to this hospital? You're just another doctor.
My relationship with Catherine is complicated.
I'm gonna sue you.
Your lawyers know where to find me.
You're unbelievable.
Grey's Anatomy. All new Thursdays, 10/9 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcasts, and Killer Podcasts presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
There are absolutely no clues in the murder of actor Bob Crane, who was known to millions as Colonel Hogan in the television series Hogan's Heroes. The police in Arizona have no idea who entered his room and beat him to death. Here's more from Kim Sedgwick of station KTAR.
Crane's body was found in his room in an apartment complex in Scottsdale. He was discovered by an actress friend who had an appointment with him. He was curled up in bed with the covers pulled up. An electrical cord was wrapped around his neck. According to the medical examiner, Crane was killed by at least 2 heavy blows to the head.
I believe the man was asleep when he was hit over the head, and he never moved after he was hit. And after he died, or while he died, a ligature was applied around his neck for good measure, but that did not contribute to his death.
The 49-year-old Crane was in Scottsdale appearing in a production of Beginner's Luck at a local dinner theater. He was best known for his role as Colonel Hogan in the TV series Hogan's Heroes, a hit program which ran 6 seasons. Police speculate that Crane was murdered with a tire iron. There was no sign of a struggle and no forced entry. Robbery has been ruled out as a motive since valuables remained untouched. Kim Sedgwick for NBC News, Phoenix.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed. I am your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcast, and Killer Podcast production. Recently, I did an episode on Bob Crane of Hogan Heroes fame. Well, I have the privilege, and I'm so lucky to be joined this week for a follow-up with his official biographers. Carol Ford and Linda Groundwater are here. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much for reaching out. I really thought it was cool that you reached out through our forms of communication, and we've made this work. And you guys are all the way on the other side of the world in Australia.
One of us is.
One of you are.
I'm just in New Jersey, so.
Well,
just a poor New England girl.
Some people will say. And let's be honest,
New Jersey.
And let's be honest, some people, I'm from Cleveland, people will say Philadelphia, New Jersey, they're their own little country themselves. So, But you guys, you have a very interesting story. And you are, again, you've earned the title of official biographers. How did you guys get involved into the life of Bob Crane and attain those titles?
Well, thanks so much again for having us. Look, I started looking into this around 2003. It was just sheer accident. I mean, I was alive when Bob was killed, but I was quite young. And my mother-in-law was watching Hogan's Heroes, and I thought, oh my goodness, I haven't seen that in ages. And I remembered while watching it how immensely entertaining and enjoyable it was, but I remembered that Bob had been killed and that I didn't really know too much about it because when I was young, my parents wouldn't let me, really read the news about it. And so when I got home, I looked it up, and we had internet by 2003, of course, and I said, oh my goodness, look at this. It's Hogan's Heroes and Murder and Sex and Murder and Sex and Hogan's Heroes and Sex and Hogan's Heroes and Murder. And I said, oh my goodness gracious. Okay, this was terrible. And then dug down underneath that, I saw other things. I saw radio, and I saw theater, and I saw charity, and I saw work trying to help the military. And I said, all of these things have kind of gotten lost under sex and murder and Hogan's Heroes. And I thought, that's not really fair. And being a former news person myself, I used to be a radio journalist, I thought, well, someone should do something about this. And so from down here in Australia, I said, I need to start reaching out. And so I reached out first to radio stations that Bob worked at. And I came across Dee Young, who is our third co-author, who hates doing these kind of interviews. So you'll good luck. If you ever get her, that'll be the biggest coup you'll ever have.
People are meant to do what they like to do. And...
Exactly. But Dee is all radio. Dee used to work at WICC, where Bob's career really took off, and she actually did meet him back when he went and visited the station, and she led me to some of Bob's family, and eventually I reached out on the old Yahoo groups and said, hey, is there anyone who knows anything about Bob, who's known Bob, who's met Bob? And Carol was on there already doing her thing, and so we joined forces, and between Carol and Dee and myself, we just exploded into this great tome that now sits in front of people.
And when, I was a member of this Hogan's Heroes fan group because, before Facebook and before, social media, we had these groups, and it was, it was like a listserv kind of thing.
I'm not that young. I remember.
And when Linda joined, because I loved Hogan's Heroes, and I think the thing that brings us all together too, in addition to radio, is our love of Hogan's Heroes. When I was a kid, I was watching Hogan's Heroes, and when I learned as a little 14-year-old kid that Bob Crane had been murdered, I was really upset by that. That's something that when you're watching a TV show, your little mind can't really grasp something that big. And I took it upon myself to research, and I would go to the library, and I'd go to, pull up the microfilm and the microfiche, and I would just start doing like this, what I call preliminary research, not knowing where it was going to go. But I was really interested in learning about who he was. And, in that little bitty time, I was learning that, his first wife and his second wife and his children, and we'll get into that later. But that was all, for a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, that was something that was really, pretty big. But fast forward, and, Hogan's Heroes is running in syndication on cable and, all of those things. And Linda joins this group, and, here we are. And she says, I'm looking for somebody who, anybody who has any connections to Bob Crane, because she didn't know who was part of the group or who wasn't. And I just remember answering back and saying, I'd love to help you. But good luck with that, because we all know what the stigma is, even at that early age, back in the early 2000s. The movie had just come out, and we'll get into that later.
That I didn't know. Mm-hmm. I didn't know the impact of that film.
Right. And so
until after I started, after we really didn't understand what the impact of that film was.
And that movie is the movie with Greg Kinnear.
Yes, and William Dafoe, yes. So Linda and I connected up. She put me in touch with Dee, and thus began my trekking across the country up to Connecticut. I've been down to South Carolina, out to the West Coast, going all over the country. The early days of researching this project were, I had spaghetti wires hanging all over my living room and kitchen and office here at home because we didn't have Zoom. I had a Radio Shack recorder.
No Skype, no Zoom.
None of that. So we did everything really old school. No transcription services. We had to do it all. Labor of love. We ended up talking to well over 200 people.
Wow.
And it was one of those things that it
In
was
the
a
middle of the
grassroots
night,
effort.
you know?
In the middle of the night for Linda. It
In
would
the
be like,
middle of the night.
it'd be 1 a.m. and, you know, Linda, we're doing this at,
That's a labor of love. That
Oh,
is
man.
seriously.
We were all in, and we never wanted to, we never wanted to like sugarcoat anything. We wanted to tell the truth. That was always the thing from the beginning. And we didn't know what we were going to learn from people. When you throw in murder and sex, and a lot of sex, you don't know what people are going to say about all that sex. Is it going to be just sex, or is it going to be, Bill Cosby? Is it going to be things where, are going into the illegal criminal side of things? And I think I can speak for both Dee and Linda if that is how it turned out. I don't think we would have continued because it just becomes, who wants to go that route, right?
We've seen enough of that with
exactly
with what's happening with Diddy and Epstein and all these
But
characters.
it was never our intent to sugarcoat or create a saint out of Bob. We are looking at the whole Bob Crane, the good and the bad. And as it turned out, yes, there was this side of him, but there's a perspective there that we'll get into. But there was also this predominantly goodness about him that is so often overlooked. And, when I give presentations, I just got back from Cleveland, actually. I was up in Port Clinton
No
a
kidding.
couple weekends ago. The
No
Liberty
kidding.
Aviation Museum has
Stay at the Island House?
No, I was up in Port Clinton, but the Liberty Aviation Museum up there has the whole Hogan's Heroes collection, the uniforms and all that. So I go up there, and when I give these presentations, after it's done, people will say, "Thank you for giving me my show back. Thank you for telling me who Bob Crane really was, because now I can go watch Hogan's Heroes again and not feel weird or icky about it." And that's really why we're here. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, and then you brought up Cosby, and that is kind of, you cannot watch the Cosby Show without. I actually I just had two former New South Wales detectives on just on Wednesday, and they were talking about I brought up the fact that we were talking this weekend, and they remembered the show. It must have been huge in Australia because they were talking.
It's still running. It hasn't stopped running here since I noticed it in 2003.
Wow.
It has not been off the air.
Wow.
So it just goes. It just goes.
And that's so crazy, and I think about, like my podcast and stuff. And it's funny when you look at demographics and you look at, areas where your shows are popular or less popular. And Australia was always like a good zone. And it's just interesting how some of the American culture has just taken over and in certain aspects. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to Americanize anything. Just the fact that it's still a popular show. And the gentleman that I was speaking with, they were reciting lines and, just doing their the little shtick that Crane would do. And it was cool. It was kind of neat to see how it transcends,
It really does. It does transcend time, and it's worldwide. They run it in Germany, under Papa Schultz, and they change it because it's not.
Right.
They can't do certain things in Germany.
They can't say certain things in
That's
Germany.
right, and so
Correct.
they change that all out and make it more vanilla. But it's very
something weird happened there too. I don't know what that was.
But anyway, yes, it does transcend across cultures and across, and people talk about, should they remake it? Who would play the? But I think that it needs to stay. It needs to stay in its universe, in its original form, and don't mess with it. It is perfection.
It's like, don't remake Back to the Future. Don't remake certain classics that are just going to live on in their perfect state, and let them be.
And you couldn't make Hogan's Heroes now. It's just, the world is a different place. The what is acceptable is different, and what was acceptable in the 60s, 20 years after the war, as Bob often said, they weren't trying to paint the Nazis as the bad guys and the German, they were trying to say, look how clever the Allies are, not look how stupid the Germans are. And if it just happened to turn out that way, it turned out that way. Whereas now, I mean, I'm actually surprised in a way that about its sticking power, because you watch some of this and you go, oh God, you couldn't do that now. I mean, the same thing even with some of Bob's radio shows. What was acceptable in the early 60s and late 50s to say and to use a stereotype and whatever, you could not get away with some of the things that they talk about now. But you can put it in its time and say, this was a product of its time, except that Hogan's Heroes seems to have expanded past that. Yes, it's a product of its time, but it's so universally a satire that, it's...
You just broke up, Linda.
Well. Sorry?
You broke up pretty bad.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit there.
I think it said it was trying to reconnect. Sorry.
Okay.
So, yes.
Give it about 30 seconds.
Yep. In the meantime, yes, I'll just...
go ahead, Carol.
I'll just talk a little bit about how that, what Linda's saying is that the era, you can't apply, 2024, culture to something that was, even 15 years ago. You have to look at the culture for where it is. It's like sometimes people will look at even like going back to the 1700s or 1500s and try to apply, what we have today, the laws of today or things like that of today to things from, in the past. And you cannot do it. You can't do it.
No, you can't. I mean, if we looked at everything through, our time machine glasses, I mean, there are things that even just 10, 15, 20 years ago, I mean, stuff on Friends that you wouldn't necessarily get away with today. But again, you put things in their place, let them be what they were. They weren't doing anything that wasn't... It sure seems maybe uncouth today, but whatever. At the time, they were just going along with what the normal things
were.
That's
right. It was. And to just kind of bring this back around to Bob, Bob was very, when Hogan's Heroes was produced, it was 1965 was when it first premiered. So 59 years ago on September 17th. 1965. And the big thing with Bob was, now he had a brother who served in the Navy in World War II. And he was very sensitive. He also had uncles, he had family members, he had friends who served in the war. Bob himself was not old enough to serve in World War II. They were looking to graduate him and his class early to be able to go off to war, but that never happened, thankfully, because VE Day happened in May of 1945. So he went on to continue his school and graduated in 1946. But he did have a brother who was very badly injured. His older brother Al, was serving on the USS Bunker Hill in the Pacific Theater of War, which in May of 1945 was struck by 2 kamikaze planes. And Al, was very, very badly injured. He was burned, badly burned over most of his body. Where the plane had hit, it actually took out, he had just left his post. He was a radio man. And it had taken out his replacement. And so he lived with survivor's guilt. But throughout that ordeal, it was a couple of weeks before the family knew that Al had survived. And this had a really profound impact on Bob because, of course, it's his brother. And it's not like, again, today where you find everything out immediately. They waited. They waited and waited. They didn't know if he was alive or dead. And when they did find out, it was like Christmas. That's what his friend Charlie Zito had said to us, that it was like Christmas. He was alive, but very, very badly injured. And so as a result of that and other, effects of the war being, just that era growing up in, Bob was very sensitive to our veterans and former POWs. And so when the Hogan's Heroes was filmed, when the pilot was filmed, he insisted before he signed on to the contract to do it, he insisted that that trailer, that pilot episode, be sent out to veterans groups across the country. We were told specifically the Midwest, and, you know, just to gauge their feedback. Because if anybody had come back and said, no, this is offensive, don't like it, he'd have been out. He would not have gone forward with it. However, what happened was they came back and they said they loved it, because without humor, they would never have been able to survive the hardships of the war. And so because of that, Bob was sold, and the rest is history. But he was always was very sensitive to the feelings of our troops, always sensitive to the feelings of our veterans, former POWs. He was very, very supportive of our veterans, and would often, and he does not get credit for this at all, but he would often go to various military bases and entertain our troops across the country. And so, yeah, very, very supportive of our military service.
Linda, you're back. Basically, unfortunately, you broke up there when you were talking.
That's okay.
But yeah, so, you know, Bob's life, again, through the lens of what my genre is true crime. And so I knew Hogan's Heroes as a TV show when I was a kid. But then you start to get the entertainment channel behind the Hollywood stories and you know, whatever, or even I think it might have been on Unsolved Mysteries. But the idea that this man had so much more to him than just his death. I mean, nobody should be remembered as just for one dying the way that he died.
Yeah.
Because there's just so much more to somebody than death. And I think what you guys are doing is, like you said about going to Cleveland and going and speaking in Port Clinton at the museum, is that you give that show back to people. And what you allow those people to do is to enjoy it and remember the innocence behind it, and not, again, like the salaciousness, the sex, murder, adultery, whatever. It just nothing that you gave them their show back, and that's what your guys' goal seems to have been, and I think that's amazing.
And to for lack of a better term, to rehumanize Bob Crane.
Very good way of putting it.
I became particularly, like, Carol was in the States, whereas I had already moved away. I am a New England girl, I promise. And
what town did you grow up in New England?
I can pack my car with the best of Massachusetts folks. I grew up near Cape Cod, and worked in radio in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire, and then married an Aussie who didn't like snow and came back. And
wow, okay.
But when I went back into the States, I became particularly close with Bob's first cousin, Jim Senich, who was very, very supportive. And always had lots of things to say. God rest his soul, he passed a few years ago now. And he provided us with a lot of insight into the Bob that he knew, the person that he knew, the family member that he knew, and how he treated his family and how he lived his life. And it was very hurtful to the family how people treated his cousin. There was a joke, and as much as I loved Cheers, I have a real issue with Frasier, the show Frasier, because at one point they made a joke, because of course Frasier's surname in the show is Crane, and he and his wife were or somebody on the show was having a child, and they looked for a first name for a child with the surname Crane, and they got to Bob and then said, Bob, oh no, we can't do that. And it was really hurtful to Bob's family to have someone make a joke about him just by using his name. And I thought, that's low. That's like a really low bar to hit. And it was unfortunate, because there is a lot of misinformation out there, and to be fair to us and to Bob, there's a lot of misinformation out there that we are not allowed to correct. because we are seen to be biased by actually speaking to these people and providing them and providing, say, Wikipedia has a ton of misinformation in it. We are not allowed to correct it because our source is our own interviews. We are not allowed to go on there and say, this is wrong, we know this is wrong. We're not allowed to do that. So
and
those
not only
things
that,
perpetuate, don't they?
Well, even that, even that piece of it is that Wikipedia is not vetted. It is.
No.
I can go on
No.
Wikipedia, Bill, and change something on your Wikipedia page without even you knowing, true or false. But somebody else can see it, and if it's true, may not like it and change it back to the more sensational piece. And so we run into that too, where we do know Wikipedia editors who have helped us in the past, but because there are people out there who don't want that information, that truth, that physical scientific evidence that we have, and it is true and it is physically proven, they don't want it up there because it doesn't suit a certain narrative. Right away, it comes right back down. So it's a twofold thing. Because we wrote the book, we are biased and we're looked upon as we are promoting our book. It doesn't matter that we are experts on this topic. It could be marigolds for all anybody knows. We still couldn't do a Wikipedia post about marigolds if we wrote a book on marigolds. But it's that side of it, but then it's also somebody's watching. Somebody's keeping a tab on it to make sure that whatever does get changed, even if somebody that we know who isn't affiliated with us or our cause or anything like that, our book or anything that we do for Bob, she can go in or they can go in and change something and, try and correct it with the actual documentation of newspaper articles and everything that they require and sources, and somebody else can just come in and overwrite it and take it down because it doesn't suit what they think is the truth. When I first tried to change something on Wikipedia, it was even before we had written and published the book. We learned that Bob Crane had graduated from high school. And in Robert Graysmith's book, he also wrote the Zodiac Killer, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And Robert Graysmith, some of his research is off, and so, but I will say for Graysmith is that he did a very good, thorough criminology investigation on the crime, and everything that has come after that has focused on the crime is just standing on his shoulders. And there are at least 2 books out there that do that. And they claim that they are the ones that know everything, and I'm not going to mention who they are. But there are other books out there that have come long after Graysmith. Graysmith was the one that did the primary research. They have stood on his shoulders for the criminology part and slapped their own theories on it and call it their own. Graysmith told us that
is his expertise. That is where
absolutely.
He excels, and he had first-hand access to a lot of the things in in the Scottsdale Police Department to be able to say, this is my work, whereas others came in after. But to his credit, I think, sorry, Carol, I think you were going to say, is that he said to us, it is long overdue for there to be a story about the whole Bob Crane that goes outside of his murder.
Yes.
He realized how much there was to Bob Crane and said, someone needs to be doing this. I'm glad you're doing it.
Absolutely. And he had wanted
that's
to do it.
That's not his job. His job was to look at the crime. Our job was to look at the person before the crime.
He had wanted to actually do the full biography, but his publisher told him, no, just do the crime. And so the bits of biographical information that are in his book are just that. They're bits. They're tiny. They're not really delving into the full Bob Crane that we did do. And when we found out that Bob had graduated from high school, in his book it says he dropped out. And that became the line. Bob Crane dropped out of high school and he would feel insecure about it for the rest of his life. Said it on Wikipedia, said it everywhere. And I tried to get that changed on Wikipedia. I had his diploma. I had his high school records from Stanford High School in Stamford, Connecticut. I had his yearbook. I had full-on documentation that this man graduated from high school. Not that it's a big deal if you graduate or not, but what's the big deal is that it's not true to say that he didn't graduate. And it became a real sticking point with with me, right, Linda? And, she knows what I'm going to go, where I'm going to go next.
Hey, let's not even talk about, there were so many things that just got perpetuated. Sadly, they got perpetuated by Robert Graysmith's book, because the rest of his book was so spot on. I mean, his work with the crime was so spot on. But what he did for the biography was, instead of kind of really researching aspects of Bob's life, because they weren't really relevant necessarily to what
he was doing,
to his murder. But what it did was, it meant that he grabbed things out of newspapers that were then proven to be wrong. So with Bob not graduating from high school, it's because he made some joke about not graduating from high school.
It started with him.
It started with Bob making a joke.
It's like, who would have said this?
I mean,
who would say these things? There's a whole
comedian.
There's a whole
funny
newspaper
guy.
article made up by somebody who shall remain Jeff Erdell. Let's not leave him nameless. Who's an old CBS fella.
Let's throw him under the bus.
I don't know where he is now. He made up the worst stuff in the world. That said that Bob had done Celebrity Cooks in Canada, and that show was supposed to air in the United States, and they were going to lead with Bob's episode. It was a lovely, how in the 70s they do a lot of celebrity cooking shows, and they looked hokey, and here's what I prepared earlier, and
I think it would be nice to go back to that, to be honest with you. That might be it might be a nice change of pace from the everyday grind and I'm just saying.
I couldn't agree more.
Maybe there's a market. Maybe there's a market there.
There could be. But Bob did Celebrity
Cooking
Cooks.
with Linda and Carol.
He did it well, and they had a great time, and everybody had a ball, and then they were going to start airing it in the United States. And Bob was killed, and so they said, oh no, we're just going to take this off. And what ended up happening was, this fella, Erdell, said that it was creepy, that he watched it and Bob was dark, and he talked about death, and he was crying, and he made sex jokes, and how inappropriate, but nobody'd seen the episode in the United States. It aired in Canada 4 or 5 times, but nobody in the United States saw it. Now what happened was, Graysmith grabbed that article because he didn't know. He said, oh look, this is what's reported that he did, and blah blah blah. And if you've read the book or seen that part of the book, Carol and I spend a fair amount of time. We spoke with 4 people who were on the floor that day and said that they couldn't have been more wrong. Erdell was completely wrong. They were very angry that this was said and used. There was that film that was made actually used part of this as a reality. And the whole thing was made up. And that is all perpetuated.
I was going to ask about that. You can't fix it. And, that's one of the interesting things about Wikipedia, too, because, they claim, and, like you said, you can go in and change whatever you want, but somebody else can go and can change. And then it's not really what it market itself as, because you would think the official biographers would be able to go in and change pertinent information regarding someone's backstory. It's not like you're putting in opinion pieces or anything like that. It's not. It's completely factual, first-hand reporting.
Yeah.
I don't see why that is an issue. And that's frustrating.
It is frustrating. And, Linda and I, we're kind of, front and center on, we don't like to say that we're trolling, but we do troll some of the Hogan's Heroes groups because, these posts come, and there was one just recently on this one Hogan's Heroes group where somebody said, I forget the original post, what it said, but it was like something about Bob Crane was murdered, and what do you all think of that, or something like that. And of course,
it was terrible. I got it right here. What a horrible way for Bob Crane to have died.
Yeah,
that's all.
Yeah. And the comments that followed were, if you look at that post and look at the comments that we are like, Linda's up when I'm asleep. I'm when, and vice versa. So we kind of have like 24-hour surveillance on this kind of stuff. And we don't get too far down into feeding the trolls, but we do correct when we feel we need to. And, when people say,
have you seen the movie?
Yeah,
that always comes up.
That's always
always comes up. Have you seen the movie? His wife had something to do with it. His wife had something to do with it. And have you seen the movie? And he wasn't a nice guy. And
the movies are always so accurate. It's just like those television shows about police and interrogations and solving the crime.
Right,
Law and Order. I mean, don't they solve cases in an hour? I mean,
a full hour.
I mean, I just talked to the two detectives from Australia, like I told you, and they said it's actually 45 minutes in a Law and Order. So,
the commercials,
and a minute for the opening and ending credits, man. So 43.
Cold open. Ending credits.
Yes, cold open.
Yep, absolutely.
You talk about solving the case and how this kind of thing is it's really spun out of control. What we also deal with is that the crime is. It was botched from the start. The crime scene was botched from the start. Evidence walked out of that room that day. Scottsdale Police Department tried, I don't know if they tried their best and just didn't know, or if they were just sloppy. But we've had interviews. We had an interview not too long ago with a podcaster who is a retired police chief and has connections with the FBI. He does a podcast called APB Cold Case, and we were telling him about how the crime scene was so mishandled, and he agreed that thought
he was going to have a stroke.
Yeah, I mean, they use Bob's case as what not to do.
Right.
Bob was, and this is something that a lot of people don't really know too much about or don't understand. There might be some flippant comments about, he was getting help, or he was a sexual addict. So Bob Crane was looking to get out of this lifestyle. It started back in the 50s in Connecticut. It was not something, nobody wakes up and says, hey, guess what? I want to be an addict. It's something that happens over time. And nobody wants to fall into some sort of and I'll call it loosely a lifestyle, where they are becoming dependent on something, whether it is a chemical or food or some sort of behavior. So in Connecticut, he's dabbling in it, and it's becoming more and more. When he moves, he and his wife and first son, they move out to Hollywood in 1956, and it's kind of a fresh start, because Bob and his first wife, Anne, she was his childhood sweetheart, they were married in 1949. They separated several times before they moved out west. And so moving out west in 1956, when he gets his the job offer at KNX CBS Radio in Hollywood, which Bob Crane's radio career is a whole hour in and of itself.
I was going to say, I know radio was the medium at that day and age. And just give a 2-minute elevator pitch on what his career was like and how it basically impacted his trajectory.
His radio career, the people who worked with him in radio have referred to him as a genius, a radio genius. He starts off in 1950 in Hornell, New York. He gets a ride. He drives up from Stamford, Connecticut, and to the to Hornell. His car breaks down. He gets a ride on the back of a hay wagon. He has bits of hay sticking up all over him, and he goes into WLEA and he says, "Okay, I'm here for the job." And they said, "Great, here's a broom." And he went, "No, I want a microphone." And they were like, "No, you're the janitor." And they're like, "Okay, well, at least you can say you're working in radio now." So he does that. He mops the floors for a week, and then the guy that they had on the air in the morning, he quit. he was gone, and they needed somebody to come on the air, and Bob had been cracking jokes the whole time that he was, there mopping the floors. And so they said, well, let's put him on the air. He's funny. He can fill the spot. And that's when he gets his break. It's not a big break, but it is a break. He gets behind the microphone. And Bob had been putting on radio shows back in his, when he was a kid, because he was a drummer. He loved his drums, and so he wanted to be in the big bands. But as the big band era was coming to a close, he wanted to stay close to music, and radio was a way for him to do that. So wherever Bob went, the drums went with him, and so he would play his drums on the air. He started experimenting with sound effects and with, voice impersonations, and he started to do what he called mess with the commercials, and that becomes really a big deal, because as he comes back to Connecticut, he goes to Bristol, Connecticut first, WBIS, then he goes to WLIZ, and then finally he's at WICC, which is a whole journey there in and of itself. But at WICC, he really starts to dig in and get his radio chops going. And this is where he is now, just really becoming very, very popular, has a market share of, I think, 17.5%.
65% market
yeah,
share.
65%
When you think about the Connecticut, this is my happiness, because I used to work in radio as well. But when you look at how many radio stations there are, and there still were a lot of radio stations back in those days, and they touched the New York market, and they touched the Boston market, and they Stamford, Connecticut could hit, or Bridgeport, Connecticut could hit a lot of other markets and have a lot of stations. And Bob was getting 65% of the listeners.
Wow.
65%. Yeah. And Boston went, he's killing us. You've got to get rid of him. EEI in Boston,
CBS affiliate, yeah,
was a CBS affiliate, and said, you've got to get rid of him. You've got to help. We've got to get him out. He's killing our ratings. This Crane guy, he's doing this stuff. We can't get him out of our systems. Help us, help us. So they tried to hire him into Boston, and he said, no, I don't want to go to Boston. What do I go to Boston for? And I'm doing really well where I am. I'm very happy where I am. And his dream was to actually go to New York. But CBS,
he's like the first Howard Stern.
Yeah,
he has been.
But you know what? But he was kinder. But you've got it spot on. And he, because as Carol said, it was really important to Bob. He was really sensitive to people. He never really wanted to hurt anyone, and he could be wild, but his intention was never to be hurtful. And I think that's one of the reasons that people really enjoyed listening to him. Was he was crazy, but he was crazy in a good way. But CBS was like, we got to get rid of this guy. Please come to Boston. And he said, no, I don't want to. And then they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. What else do we do with him in CBS? Well, Ralph Story went off to do what Bob called the crooked $64,000 question. And they needed someone to take his place. So they said, Bob, please come out. He said, I don't know, California. They said, please come out. So they sent Bob out to California, earning a ridiculous sum of money in those days, and put him on a no acting clause for 5 years because they were losing a lot of their disc jockeys to television. Either to be hosts of shows like Ralph Story, or to do acting, other acting and emceeing work and whatever. So they said, look, please come out. And he said, I don't know. I have control over everything I want to do here in Connecticut. And of course, in those days, the unions were huge, and disc jockeys couldn't play their own records. You had to have an engineer to do that. Well, Bob's show was set up so that he needed to be able to play his own stuff, because a lot of what Bob did was something that came to him instantly. And Bob could grab a record off the shelf and cue it up in 20 seconds. And he hadn't thought of this until about a minute earlier. Well, an engineer can't do that for you. So he got special dispensation from the unions so that he still had an engineer who would do stuff for him, but he was also allowed to do his own thing. And so with all of that, he said, yeah, okay, I'll go. And EEI was thrilled. ICC not so happy, but then Bob went out into California and started his career out there.
And to add on to that just really quickly too, Bob's career in radio, it spanned 15 years because he was working from 1950 through 1965. During the time he was working at KNX, he was there for 5 years when they finally said, well, we better lift the no acting clause or we're going to lose them. And so they went on a year-to-year handshake agreement, more or less.
I was going to say, did that hold him back? That had to have been frustrating.
It was very frustrating for him. He did one little pilot in 1959 that they just kind of said, okay, we'll look the other way. It was called Picture Window. It didn't go anywhere. It was with Max Schulman.
It was awful.
It wasn't, yeah.
Hey,
since 1959. But what then happened was that by 1961...
Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm fine.
We have sound
really.
effects
I'll
in
just
this
get my heart off
episode.
the ceiling if that's okay.
In 1961 or so, that no acting clause is lifted. And
Okay.
that's when you start to see him on the Dick Van Dyke Show, which then led to the Donna Reed Show, which then led to
the
Hogan's
Donna Reed
Heroes. Donna Reed Show, he left on his own. It was not because he was angry and stormed out because he wanted more money. It was not because he got fired. You know, it was not for any of these.
Is that a narrative that
It's
people...
a narrative.
Okay.
It absolutely is
It's
a
a
narrative.
thing.
But he left because he was bored. He was tired of playing the next door neighbor, father, husband, type character, white picket fence.
Father
He
knows
wanted
best
something.
stuff. No,
Yeah,
it
he
was
wanted something that
boring.
was much different. Much different.
He
And
was
so as soon as he
offered,
left,
please don't eat the daisies.
he turned it down. My
turned it
Mother the
down.
Car.
My Mother the Car.
A thing with
Great
was it
ideas.
Well, this one's even better. It was a thing where there was a picture of General Custer hanging on the wall that would talk.
Oh, yeah.
And they wanted him to do that. And he was like, are you kidding me? And then Hogan's Heroes comes along. So while he's working...
May I just say, to be fair to CBS, I think it was a good idea for them to put that. I think it was good for Bob that they put that no acting clause in there because
Absolutely.
Bob didn't have experience in what he was doing. So to be able to get to the point of getting the Dick Van Dyke Show and Donna Reed, he had to be doing things that weren't, I'm just going to be dragged by Hollywood. He didn't want to be an MC. He didn't want to do the Tonight Show, although it was an offer. He wanted to. He wanted to act, and so he could do community theater. He could take acting lessons with Stella Adler. He could do all these things to teach, to learn. For Bob, it was always about learning, and so for them to enforce that no acting clause in his contract was actually good, because he could take the time, because Bob's mind was always running 1,000,000 miles an hour. And if somebody had offered him some acting earlier, he might have jumped, because
I think so.
I can do this, I can learn this, because Bob was always on to that next best thing for himself, what he wanted for himself. And he would say to his cousin in audio letters that we have heard, I really want to get into the acting thing. I really want to get into the acting thing. But Gig Young and Jack Lemmon kept getting his roles, and Tony Randall kept getting his roles. Those were the roles that he really wanted, and these people kept getting his roles. But he didn't have the experience that he needed, and the learning that he needed, and the education and the time in the business to understand the way to act, not just to be the guy who shows up and throws this persona out. He needed to learn to act. And so for them to put that clause in his contract actually served him well, as frustrating as it may have been for him. So by the time he got to the Dick Van Dyke Show, that was it. That was a brilliant...
He's a well-polished...
Right, and the reason he got to the Dick Van Dyke Show was because during those first 5 years at KNX, you get to a point where he is now, you had to, there was a premium to advertise on Bob's show. That's how over the top he was with his brand of humor. He was doing things in radio that really had rarely, or if ever, had been done before. He
they used to bring
started
people in
a
to
component.
watch.
Yes, they did, and they called it a spectator sport. Leo McElroy said it was. Who worked with Bob at KNX. He said it was like watching a spectator sport, watching him behind the mic. But he was also then doing, and Linda mentioned the Tonight Show and emceeing, and there's a reason for that. He was doing later on, and from about 1962 on, he was doing the celebrity interview component of his show. So he would do his traditional show from 6 to 9 every weekday morning, and then also on Saturdays. And then the last hour of the show was, the last hour of the show was a celebrity interview, and sometimes it would be two celebrities on, and they would, this is how Bob started to network in the full-on entertainment industry. He was able to connect with these people. They wanted to be on his show. Donna Reed had been on his show. Dick Van Dyke had been on his show. Maury Amsterdam. They were, Mary Tyler Moore. They had all been on his show to the point that when he wanted to start to break into acting, he had already made these connections. And when the story goes is that he begged Carl Reiner to be on the Dick Van Dyke Show. Don't know if that's true or not, but that's the story. But he does go on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and it's a very popular episode, Who Wants to Play Cleopatra? Or somebody has to play Cleopatra. Mm-hmm. It's in the top 10. It's rated in the top 10 of the Dick Van Dyke Show. Donna Reed is watching that. And she calls up and she says, I want you to come on for a guest role, and he does, and then that leads to the full role. And so while he's at KNX, he's going to his work at the radio station, getting there from 6, he's there on the air 6 a.m. to 10 o'clock. Then he runs across the street and does what he needs to do for Donna Reed. He does his makeup while he's in his chair, in his booth at KNX. Runs across the street, does whatever he needs to do, whether it's rehearsal or filming or reading, whatever. Goes back over to KNX when that is all done. And then he, does what he needs to do to prepare for his next show. Now, he lives about an hour away, give or take, depending on traffic. And he's getting home 9, 10 o'clock at night. He's quickly eating a meal. The kids are to bed. And, he goes to bed. He's up at 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m. the next morning to do it all over again. So that's when he's working at Donna Reed. When he leaves Donna Reed, now he gets Hogan's Heroes. And so Hogan's Heroes, the audition was in 1964, December of 1964. The pilot was filmed in January of 1965, and it was signed by CBS to be greenlit for the the fall 1965 season in the spring of 1965. And he has to make a decision. He films about 6 episodes of Hogan's Heroes while working at KNX. And I like to study those episodes because he looks really tired. He looks happy, but he looks pretty tired because now he's not just a supporting character, he is the star. And so he's carrying, as Robert Clary told Linda in a letter, he's carrying like 85% of the dialogue. He's the star. And so now something's got to give. And so there were newspaper articles that say Crane gambles on Hogan's Heroes, because at that point, what's he going to do? He's already making.
Heroes.
Well, TV.
Yes.
I mean, TV was still.
But he was also making a double income between between Donna Reed and KNX.
Sure.
So he was making at that point $150,000, which if you do the math in 1965, that's a lot of money.
Doing pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So he was earning less on Hogan's Heroes than he was on KNX, and he said,
"But there's something to be about being the star."
Mm-hmm. He also invested into Hogan's Heroes.
He always thought he could do. This is what he really wanted. To be fair to his family, his wife was supportive of that and said, "You follow your dream. This is what you want." And it turned out well. And he got 2 Emmy nominations. He didn't win, but he got 2 Emmy nominations. It's hard. When you look at those days, you're up against Don Adams and his own
and Dick Van Dyke.
And Dick Van Dyke, I mean, and that's
Dick
not
Van
to say that he couldn't have won, but you look at those days and you go, these shows are classic. Who's going, sorry about that, Chief. Really? How do you pick? How do you pick?
The Monkeys.
You're right.
And the Monkeys won one year, So it's
like Nick at Night all wrapped in one.
He followed his dreams, and in the end, it didn't end well for him. because his personal, just to come kind of full circle back to your your own show, it didn't end well for him, but he was trying his very best to continue to follow his dreams and to try and make things better. And he did have another show lined up in the works when he was killed.
I was going to ask about that, like where his
the
career
Hawaii
was
experience. Yeah, he was. It was a little less of what he wanted to do, but it was coming back into television, and it was having that chance to reinvent himself, so to speak. He knew that he was failing in many aspects of his life. He had continued to act, and one of the things that I've always said, which is fairly evident in the book, I think, is that Bob always wanted to control his own life, and that's good, because we should have control of our own lives, but he couldn't always see what was best for him, and he did have an addictive personality, and so it was hard for him. He knew that his first marriage had failed because of his proclivities, his addiction, which had started way back in the 50s. His marriage ended in 1969, 1970. Divorce was finalized in 1970. He'd been married for 20 years, and he already had, more than a decade of this kind of issue with his life. He knew that it was a problem. His second wife knew that it was a problem, but accepted it, and didn't enjoy it, but accepted it for what it was. She knew that about him when she married him, and he was trying so hard. In the end, he was seeking help. He didn't get a chance to get that far because somebody didn't want him to get that far, whoever that was, or for whatever reason. Bob was killed before he had the chance to really get the help that he actually sought on his own. Nobody came to him and said, "Hey, Bob, you need help." Bob said, "My life is a mess. I'm losing work. I'm losing my family. I need help." He was reconciling with his wife at the time that he died, his second wife, at the time that he died. There had been divorce papers filed. That devastated him. He was reconciling. There is a video of them less than 2 weeks before he was killed, loving, and I'm moving home and I'm bringing these things home. He was coming back to his family. He realized what his shortfalls were. He realized what his issues were, and he wanted to do something about it. But for whatever reason, or for whomever's reason, he didn't get that chance and he didn't get that far. But again, these are things that are not particularly well known because, again, we are not allowed to correct the errors that are out there. We've seen the video.
Yes, we have seen the video.
We've seen the video.
Yes.
We have talked to the people. We have seen the paperwork. We know what was happening. But Bob,
and we talked about it.
Bob went to for help. Who Bob first went to for help. He told us about his discussions with Bob, and again, he just didn't have the chance to change it.
And Bob did talk about his reconciliation attempts with Patty to other family members, which after his murder, they were forthcoming about in the press. And, it's one of those things where at the end of the day, would we know, do we know if they actually would have been successful in reconciliation? No, we don't. Do we know that he wanted to reconcile and that they were trying to reconcile? Yes, we do know that. And we do have physical proof of it. And what to me is, and to Linda and Dee, is sad, is that you have this man who was only 49 years old when he died. Gosh. And in those 49 years, he packed in so much life, so much goodness, so much outreach. If somebody wanted something from him, if they needed help, if they never had to ask twice. He was there for his family. He was there for his friends. His friends adored him. His school friends from Stamford, Connecticut. The last class reunion that he went to was the 1976 class reunion, their 30-year reunion, and the smiles. He's in all these pictures, and to them, he's just Bobby. he's just Bobby, you know.
Yeah.
Think of your classmates. He was their drummer boy. You know, when we would talk with all of the people, his colleagues, you know, Bob was kind to those he worked with, and he was kind to those he knew. He wanted to do good and to be kind. Is he perfect? Was he perfect? No, because nobody is. I'm not. And, you know, we all have our moments where we trip and fall, sometimes literally, like I did the other night and sprained my ankle. But we do all, you know, have those, you know, we are not perfect. As human beings, we are not perfect. And Bob certainly was not. And unfortunately, he is judged so harshly. You know, going back to people that we try to correct or, you know, try and just talk to on social media who are posting comments. You know, somebody said, Linda, I don't see your name on you know, this book anywhere, meaning Graysmith's book.
Yeah.
And I commented back on that, and I said, obviously you don't know who Linda Groundwater is, because if you took a minute and just Google Bob Crane's name, as you know, Bill, we come up. We're pretty, you know, we aren't far down on the food chain. We're not number 1 or number 2. It's okay. But we're there. We're in the mix, and we're pretty solid in the mix. And people are opposed to learning more of the perspective that surrounded Bob Crane's addiction. You know, we talked with, because Linda and I are not, you know, we're not experts in this field of addiction. We are not psychologists, and, you know, we can't put Bob Crane on, you know, the psychologist's couch and, you know, try to analyze him, psychoanalyze him, but we can try and get perspective from people who are experts. And so we talked with 4 experts in sexual addiction, plus an expert in men's sexual health, to try and understand. And they had different, they had their different perspectives as to where it, you know, where he fell in their, you know, scope of knowledge. But it did provide some kind of an understanding of where he was mentally, because what you have, and this is where autofocus just goes completely off the rails. They only wanted to focus on bad Bob. They just wanted bad boy Bob because he was the most interesting, and he wasn't interesting enough. So they had to make things up, and they had to, you know, it wasn't meant to be true or definitive, and good Bob wasn't nearly as good, you know, interesting as bad Bob. And Bob Crane himself, in fact, isn't even interesting at all. So let's just create a character and name him Bob Crane. But there's so much, you know, people are complex. I'm complex, you're complex, we're all complex creatures. And to just slap, as we started this interview off, by saying Bob Crane is only known as a murder victim, as a sexual addict and tabloid headline, and as Hogan's Heroes, and stuff him into that tiny little box without any other perspective or understanding is a disservice not just to him, but to all who knew him and loved him, and to any of us, because that's not fair. We all deserve to have that understanding. And since Bob Crane is not here to tell it himself, we humbly do it for him. Bob did want to write his own book, but he never got a chance to do that. And I look at that and I say he would have probably, you know, had a lot to say to help other people who might be struggling in some form of addiction.
I think part of if I can add to that too, is, and I've said this in other podcasts, and I think even in our own, is that part of the problem is that people still look at sex like they're 12 years old. There is still this great discomfort about discussing sex. Now, the way people talk about his addiction is, I wish my wife had that kind of addiction, ha ha ha. You know, it's just an excuse to cheat on your wife. Well, that you might do that with a couple of women. Heck, you might even do that with 10 women. Bob slept with literally hundreds of women. That is not just an excuse to cheat on your wife. That's a problem. And you wouldn't talk about alcoholics that way. But alcoholics are addicts. You know, you wouldn't talk about drug users that way. But drug users are addicts. But sex addicts, they still go, hee, sex, hee, and they lose that whole, so they think it's funny. They don't
Yeah.
understand that sex
Funny
can
or
be
perverted.
devastating the same way that alcohol and drugs can be devastating, because you can have if you can have a casual drink and be happy with it. I don't. I hate the taste of alcohol, so I don't have this issue. But I presume you could have a glass of wine and go, gee, that's a nice glass of wine, and not need to drink 3 bottles that night. But not everyone can do that, and you don't make fun of alcoholics for doing that. People can have sex and enjoy it and have it once a day or once a week or once a month or whatever it is, and not feel like they need to do it and think it all the time. But sex addicts can't do that. And there's so little understood even now, because you had the whole Pete Rose thing. You had David Duchovny, who went off for the weekend and was cured. You have Tiger Woods, who wasn't an addict, he was just a jerk. So that there's a lack of understanding about actual addiction when it comes to sex.
I mean, when you go into the Perkins waitress, it's, let's just be honest. But I mean, but you're right. You're absolutely 100% right. I mean, I talk about mental health a lot, because I've dealt with it my whole life. It's certain stigmas get applied to certain things. Certain things are taboo. Oh my, it's sex. Oh my, oh, it's pornography. Oh gosh, everybody cover your eyes, clutch your pearls.
Right.
Yeah, look around. Like that. Like, give me a break.
You bring up pornography. I want to say this because this is super important. We mentioned some Bill Cosby earlier, and the things that Bob Crane, was he doing anything criminal? And the answer to that is no. Everybody that Bob slept with, they were adult consensual women.
Yeah, he wasn't Harvey Weinstein.
Right. Who, when asked if they wanted to participate in his amateur pornography, they agreed to it. If they didn't want to do it, he, with Bob, what
that would
we
be the
learned,
story.
That's right. What we learned from, oh my gosh, so many people, he didn't. Yes, was he a predator out looking for a good time? Yes, you can call him that because he is looking for that one night stand. But if he were to go up to, this woman here and say, hey, I'm Colonel Hogan, do you want to, and she was like, oh yeah, no, I don't swing that way. Okay, fine, how about you? And a perfect example of that is Victoria Berry Wells, who had the unfortunate stigma of being told, having everybody think that she was sleeping with him all this time, when in fact she turned him down. She told us that she turned him down, and he became more of a father figure to her. And he would run to the pharmacy and get her, her prescription for, antibiotics if she had a flu or something like that. He never, once she said no, that door was shut. It wasn't about that for him. It was about pleasure for both parties. And if somebody is being forced to do something they don't want to do, then that's not pleasurable, and that is not what he was looking for. If you were into that and you wanted to go have a wild night, he was all about it. But if you said no, it was off the table. And that's really important to get that across, because people assume he was forcing women, that the cameras were being hidden, which I'm sorry, I don't care how small you think the cameras could have been made in 1978. They were not that small, and the crime scene is loaded with his equipment setup. And so nobody was being forced or coerced in any negative way to participate in any of these activities with Bob. It was all consensual and approved.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the most important thing to kind of convey here, is that, one, addiction is a real thing. Two, he wasn't doing anything that we now look at as part of the Me Too movement, or Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, Louis C.K., you name them. They were doing weird other things, not consensual. And here we have somebody who's doing consensual activities, and yet, because of the era that it occurred in, and the fact that we still haven't fully embraced certain aspects of our human bodies, he gets maligned to this sexual deviant. And at the end of the day, what you guys are...
Can we just add that
yes,
he's the one being maligned, but you'll notice nobody says anything about all the women. So Bob gets maligned
yeah.
for having sex with women, but the women who know that he's married, know he has this reputation, maybe married themselves, maybe very high profile themselves. Nobody ever says anything about them.
Touche.
And
Touche.
considering that they all walked in consensually, and you can see their consent on tape.
Yeah.
And they're fully aware that the camera is there because they're playing for the camera. Nobody says anything about them. It's all about him. It doesn't make him better. It just means that what is going on,
because
that it has to be all about him.
Because you have to remember too that Bob Crane as Colonel Hogan is this very clean cut, all American, perfect kind of person. He is not, when he is found murdered in his apartment in Scottsdale, and all of this comes out, it shatters this public image of Colonel Hogan being completely, Mr. Americana, perfect. Nothing is going to take him, apart. He's wonderful. And that's where you start to see the splintering of, it's almost like shock, where you can't wrap your head around the fact that Colonel Hogan, who I love to watch, is now this sexual deviant. And that's why when we talk to people, and they are so happy to hear what we have to say. And again, it's not because we're trying to sugarcoat anything. What we have to say is, very, it's balanced. It's just that, there's so much of the negative out there that we're trying to explain that there is perspective here. And they say, thank you for giving me my show back, because when I learned that he was the sexual deviant, I couldn't watch it anymore because, ew, yuck. But, that in and of itself, there is this whole, perception of Bob Crane being Colonel Hogan. And, they couldn't separate. He was typecast. They couldn't separate Hogan from Bob. And when Bob was murdered, it was like Colonel Hogan got murdered. And people had a hard time accepting that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of those situations where, the crime unfortunately outweighs the man, and that's the era. I mean, I don't know if that would be the case nowadays because of the fact that we have access to all these different things, and his library, his past catalog, the things that he did in radio in the 50s, and it's just one of those shames that we aren't in a situation where there's a resolution. You guys have done a great job doing what you do in protecting his name and restoring his name and his legacy. And I think that's really what the end goal is of what you guys have set out to accomplish. And I think you've accomplished that, especially.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that is our goal. I think that we have done, I know we've done a lot of good work, but we're not done yet. And that's why we like coming on podcasts and talking with folks about Bob from all aspects. Let's talk about his murder. Let's talk about the sex. Let's talk about his radio career. Our goal is not to line our pockets with profits from the book. My publisher has to eat, so of course my publisher, gets paid. But our author profits are donated to charities, or they go back into, and we don't get tons of money from it, but they do go back into, keeping our work going. Bill, as you know, running a podcast is expensive. You have to pay for Riverside. You have to pay for your mic, and you have to, do all those things. So in order to be able to do the things, our outreach and continued work, we do put money back into it from our book, our author profits, but we also donate our author profits as well to various charities, including the Liberty Aviation Museum. So, we will continue to do this as long as we can.
That's incredible. That's great. And Linda, do you have any final last words on the subject?
Oh, no, look, I think Carol's really got it spot on. I mean, our goal is really just for, we're not asking anyone to think of Bob as a perfect human being. We're just asking for people to see him as a human being, a whole human being, not just a fellow with an addiction, but look at what he was able to do in spite of his addiction. or along with his addiction, or, look at the fact that people fight every day. I happen to have just picked up the Matthew Perry autobiography or memoir or whatever you call it, and it's particularly striking now that he's passed. And what he says in the first chapter that I happen to have read this morning is that, it's always there. It's always there. It's always there. And yet I had to fight and fight and fight. And this is what Bob did. And did he give into it sometimes? Sure he did, because it's hard to fight all the time. And we're not making him out to be a hero, but I think what it's important to do is to just realize that he's a human being like any other human being. And because he happened to play a particularly larger-than-life hero on television doesn't mean that he wasn't just an ordinary guy fighting a difficult fight. And that's all we ask people to do. Use your head, think about things critically with what you're reading, and understand that he had loved ones and friends just like we all do.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, again, nobody's perfect, and nobody should be remembered for how they died in a tragic situation where they weren't at fault. It's not like he went and committed some crime and died in the process. This is somebody that was killed tragically, and the case remains unsolved. And so I applaud you guys on what you have done. I think it's really great counterbalance to what I had put out previously, and this gives people a lot of information and opportunity to see Bob as more than just a tabloid headline, like you had said, or even just Colonel Hogan, or any of those things. And so thank you guys so much for coming on. And I mean, we could talk about this for hours, and I'm sure yes. And hey, maybe we'll have you on again, and I'd love to talk to you again, seriously. So thank you guys so much.
Love it. Thank you, Bill, so very much.
Yeah, keep doing the good work that you guys have been doing, and definitely check out the book, Bob Hogan. And where could they find your book?
Sure. So the book is Bob Crane, The Definitive Biography. We have a website where everything that we have done, not just the book, but the podcasts that we do and all the interviews that we do, it is vote4bobcrane.org. So vote4bobcrane.org. That came up when we were trying to get him in the Hall of Fame, the Radio Hall of Fame, and we're still trying that. So vote4bobcrane.org is where you can find all of our work. We have air checks of his radio show on our YouTube channel, and the podcasts and the book and all of that we do is there. So
that's great. That's great. Well, thank you very much for making the time on this Saturday, or Sunday for some people over there.
Sunday.
Yeah, some people in Australia. Saturday night for Carol. Saturday evening for Bill. It's going to be a wild, crazy time. So, you guys, seriously, good stuff. Really appreciate you coming on. I know, you guys clearly have put in tons of hours, and it shows. So, thank you again.
Thank you, Bill. Have a great one.
Thank you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you again so much to Carol and Linda for joining me this week to discuss the Bob Crane biography and history of his life. And it does give you a lot more insight into the person that he was opposed to the victim that he became. So in these cases, it is important to know that there is more to somebody than just their victimhood. And again, we see this happen time and again in lots of different cases, but I appreciate Carol and Linda coming on and enlightening us on the type of person that Bob was, and that this was who he really was and not the way that he died, and that's not the way that he should be remembered. So again, thanks to Carol and Linda, and thank you guys for tuning into this week's episode. As you know, I drop new episodes every Friday. I know that this summer was a little inconsistent. It's been quite a roller coaster with ups and downs with friends and health and all that crazy stuff that just so happens to happen in life. And I will be bringing you a new episode with Sarah Ferris of Sarah Ferris Media, and we'll be discussing another true crime case, and you should expect to see that next Friday. So appreciate you guys, and as always, until next week, stay healthy and be safe.
This is where projects come to life. Our showrooms are designed to inspire with the latest products from top brands, curated in an inviting, hands-on environment, and a team of industry experts to support your project. We'll be there to make sure everything goes as planned, from product selection to delivery coordination. At Ferguson Bath, Kitchen and Lighting Gallery, your project is our priority.
Discover great brands like American Standard at your local Ferguson showroom.
On the morning of August 1st, 1966, shots ring out from the observation deck of the clock tower on the University of Texas campus. It marks the infamous beginning of the modern era of mass shootings in America.
You're listening to Stop the Killing podcast. Join us as we take you behind the crime scene tape to explain global mass shootings and mass attacks. I'm Sarah Ferris, but more importantly, this is Catherine Schweit, the former head of the FBI's active shooter program.
I spent 5 years as the FBI's top executive looking for answers to the mass shooting crisis. I've been at the shooting scenes, I've traced heroic acts of bravery, and I've sat silently and listened to the heart-wrenching stories from survivors.
Amongst this horror, there is hope. We all hold the key to stop the killing. You just need to know how to unlock the door. Download Stop the Killing and be part of the solution. Search Stop the Killing on Apple, Spotify, and all the usual suspects.